I think we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to launch the Posterity Fireside Series, where I host experts to uncover their views and perspectives on emerging topics. First, I want to wish each and every one of you a happy Earth Day. And I do hope that today's Earth Day is an everyday of use. This year's theme is around restoring our Earth. Since its inception in 1970, Earth Day covers natural processes, emerging green technologies, and innovative thinking that can restore the world's ecosystems. This is especially important in relation to the climate crisis, and in order to enact real change, our government must be aware of the desire of their residents to have environmental issues be at the forefront of the policies. There is no better way to restore our Earth than through nature-based solutions, or NBS, as we're going to refer to them in this chat today. NBS, put simply, is a discipline that uses alternative and non-traditional approaches to overcome environmental issues. Nature-based solutions are an essential component of the overall global efforts to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are a vital complement, NBS, they are a vital complement to achieve decarbonization, reducing climate change risks, and establishing climate resilient societies. They value harmony between people and nature, as well as ecological development, and represent a holistic, people-centered response to climate change. They are effective, long-term, cost-efficient, and globally scalable. I would like to kick off this series, and I have the honor to do that with my friend, Dr. M. Sanjayan, the Chief Executive Officer at Conservation International, who will be sharing his thoughts on what is the potential for NBS, for nature-based solutions, in the Middle East region and globally. Dr. Sanjayan is a global conservation scientist whose work spans from genetics to wildlife migration to nature's impact on human well-being. He has served as a Conservation International's Chief Executive Officer since 2017 and is a visiting researcher at UCLA and a distinguished professor of practice at Arizona State University. He is also a Cato Fellow at the Aspen Institute, as well as a very avid diver. Welcome, Dr. Sanjayan. I would like you first to share your thoughts on the challenges facing our planet and the importance of nature-based solutions.
Thank you for that very warm introduction, Ibrahim. Good to see you again after a couple of years when we had the pleasure of meeting in the UAE. Let me start by wishing everyone a happy Earth Day, and also to say, Ramadan Mubarak. It's wonderful that these two amazing celebrations and important days coincide. So maybe this year is extra blessings on Earth Day. Let me give you a few thoughts, spend maybe 10 minutes just giving you a little bit of backstory, and then we can get into discussion, because I hope this could be as engaging as possible for our audience. So I was born in Sri Lanka. Of course, you have quite a large Sri Lankan population around you in the Middle East, and in particular in the UAE. But when I was born in Sri Lanka, I was born very close to the ocean. You could see the ocean from my home. And all my cousins and friends would go to the ocean every day. Even my family every evening would walk down to the beach. But when I was born, my grandmother, who was the matriarch of the family, kind of the head of the family, if you know how grandmothers are, looked at the hair on my head. Like, you know how they tell fortune sometimes by reading your palm print? Well, for babies in Sri Lanka, they look at the head and they look at the way the hair is growing on the head, because, you know, babies don't have palm prints.
Yeah.
And they make these sort of predictions. And usually they're fun things like, you know, he's going to be very, you know, brave, or she's going to be, you know, I don't know, very smart. But for me, my grandmother got very scared by what she saw on my head. And she told the family that what the sign is, that I would die by drowning. So this news was taken by the whole family, and they prevented me from ever going into the water. So I was not allowed to go to the beach. I was not allowed to swim. I was not allowed to get into rivers. In fact, in our house back in those days, you know, this was in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, we had, you know, bathtubs. Everyone had bathtubs. You didn't have showers back then. But in my house, they installed a shower because they did not want me to go sit inside water. And if you think about it, it's a very logical decision. If they say to you, hey, you're going to die by drowning, the logical thing, of course, is don't go in the water, right?
True. Yes.
But it's interesting, if I asked you, Ibrahim, if you knew this was maybe in the future of your children or something like this, would you teach them to swim? Is a very different question. So when I was about 5 or 6 years old, this was in Sri Lanka, never allowed to go into the ocean, my family moved to West Africa. My father worked for refugee programs for the UN and the World Bank, and we moved to Africa. And it's in Africa at the age of about 8 or 9 years old that my mother taught me how to swim. And my mother is not a good swimmer, but she taught me how to swim, not in the ocean, but in a pit made from, you know, when they do diamond mining, when they do open pit diamond mining, you know, they leave behind a pit in the forest, and this pit fills with water.
Yeah.
And it's brown. And there are frogs and snakes and turtles living in it. This is where my mother taught me how to swim. And as you know, because I've done this with you, you know, from that moment, it transformed my life. I've quite literally been diving in almost every ocean around the planet, from the Arctic to the waters off of, you know, the UAE, to, you know, the Red Sea, to, you know, Raja Ampat, Indonesia. And it's been a really transformational journey for me. Now, I asked my mother late in life, why did she break tradition and do this? Why did she do this? And she didn't have a very clear explanation for me. But later, I started thinking about this. And this is what, much later in life, I kind of realized about my grandmother and my mother and the difference between the two. And I'll tell you why this story is important. My grandmother loved me, like every grandmother loves you. And she wanted to protect me because she knew she had very little time with me. So her best way to protect me is to keep me safe, like this.
Yes.
My mother loved me, of course, but also wanted to invest in my life. So for her, that investment, that slight risk that she was taking was looking forward and looking into the future. It's not about protecting me or loving me. It's about valuing my life. And I use this in some ways as an analogy for conservation. You know, you and I grew up at a time when our love for nature is what dominated the way we think about things. If I look at all these books in my office, many of them are written by, you know, these big champions of nature, you know, E.O. Wilson or whoever else might be out there. And that language that they use is the language of love. You love nature, thus you must protect it. But I know now, having traveled the world, working at Conservation International, that love alone is not enough. You also have to value it. Because if you don't value it, you have no mechanism for much of the world to participate in protecting life. And so this became kind of a mission for me, and it's also really a mission for Conservation International. Of course, it's okay to say, I love tigers, I love whale sharks, I love sea turtles, you know, I love lions, whatever. It's fine to say that. But if you don't find a way to make sure people can value it, you can't scale it. It will always be a hobby. It will always be something you will do after you do everything else. And this is the transformation that I'm seeing in the conservation world today. The last 18 months for you as well as for everyone around the world has been completely transformational because of COVID. You know this. If you ever needed a reminder of the value of nature, all you had to do was look outside. This pandemic, like every other pandemic out there, came from nature, came from our destruction of nature. Just like SARS, just like Zika, just like Ebola, just like HIV, this pandemic came from nature, and it's our destruction of nature that brought it close to us. And you also see the value of nature going forward, because guess what people love to do during lockdown? They all wanted to go outside.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, here, I live just outside Washington, D.C. You know, I ride my bicycle all the time now. Like, that's my way of getting exercise, because can't go to the gym and it's too cold to swim in the ocean. But you go out there and you start cycling, and you can't cycle on the trails here in Washington, D.C. on weekends. I don't cycle on the bicycle trails. I cycle on the road because it is so crowded. It's so crowded. And I'm sure you saw the same thing during the lockdown periods in the UAE. You saw it in London.
Yes.
So it made people realize about this value of nature. The big thing that I realized over the last 12 months is that every company that we work with, whether it is Apple or P&G or Walmart or Tiffany's or MasterCard, they stayed the course. They not only stayed true to their environmental commitments, most of them doubled down, tripled down. So 18 months ago, 2 years ago when I met you, the kind of size of the deals or the investments that companies were making in conservation or sustainability or climate change, you know, you and I discussed it. Today, 24 months later, it's honestly, it's not twice, it's 10x bigger. Back then, a very big deal would be in the $2, $3, $4, $5, $10 million. Now,
why is that? Why 10x bigger?
I'll tell you why. I don't know exactly why, right? So I'm also puzzled by this. And by the way, there is one exception, and the exception is understandable. The exception is the airline industry. And that's partly because they are in a very different crisis, and that is going to take more time to recover. The reason I think is two. One is companies understand science, they understand data. They're looking at the long run. They look at climate change, they look at disruption of supply chains, they look at social unrest, and they realize that if they don't build for the long term, their whole supply chain, their whole value chain is really compromised, really, really compromised. The second thing is the best companies, and you work for one of the best companies out there, understand that it is only in crisis, it's only in headwinds that you can actually make progress. So, you know, I cycle, I tell you, and if you bicycle, you'll know this. You can never overtake someone on the downhill. Yeah. You can only pass someone on the uphill. It's really an interesting thing, right? And that's why when we watch the Tour de France, we watch the mountain stage. The speed is the slowest, but it's where the most action happens, the most acceleration happens. It's the same thing. In headwinds, if you're an Apple, if you're a P&G, if you're a MasterCard, this is the moment to accelerate from the rest of the pack. So I think these CEOs now know it's in deeply personal terms. They understand what's in their future. They're transitioning from, let's protect nature because it's a wonderful thing and like our customers might like it. And it's all about love. It's about a t-shirt. It's about a small gesture we make. It's about a logo. It's about a label, to the point where they're saying, no, it's about value. And that's the biggest and most impressive thing I've seen in the last 12 months. The second thing is governments. So governments too, obviously, in the last 12 months, have dramatically changed their tune, if you will, dramatically in some places. In the United States, obviously very dramatic. Yeah. But it's also true, you're seeing this in China. You know, China, during the middle of the pandemic, made a commitment to be carbon neutral, I think, by 2060. This is extraordinary.
Yes.
It's extraordinary. You know, this is within you, inshallah, it's between you and my lifetime, we might see this. In you and my lifetime, we might see China actually being carbon neutral. And the United States is making now a commitment to half its emissions by 2030. This is a dramatic transformation. Yeah. So I think these are pretty big leaps you're making. You know, oil and gas companies, you know, you're in a region where fossil fuels are still very, very important. The transformations I've seen, like the two that I've had conversations at the CEO level, you know, Shell and BP, these transitions that they are making are big. I mean, BP is basically saying we're reducing total emissions by 40%. And that's real emissions. That's how much oil they're pulling out of the ground. So I think there is a real way. Look, there's many ways in which this can go wrong. I'm very hopeful because of what I've seen in the last 12 months. I think this is a big wake-up call for the planet. I finally think we're kind of on the right path. Now we need to make sure that benefits of nature go equitably to the people on the ground, that it isn't still managed by the few on behalf of the many, with very many left out of the equation, that it's racially just, racial justice, diversity, equity are built into it. And we need to make sure that the pathways are numerous and self-reinforcing. So I'm going to stop there, but this is sort of my
very inspiring. Very inspiring. And by the way, I have a couple of questions, and please, for our attendees and the audience, feel free to put your questions on the Q&A tab, and I'll make sure that I share them with Sanjayan and answer them. But before I ask my question on NBS, I think you inspired us all with the passion and enthusiasm about how companies are getting involved. And especially as we speak today, they're going to have the climate summit. Biden is going to announce the 53% by 2030. We're going to have leaders. But do you really think the post-COVID-19 era will be the sustainability and climate action era?
I think it has the possibility to be that.
Okay.
I think it has the possibility to be that, but whether or not it emerges as that is up to us. And the truth is, we don't really have another decade to make this work. All the science was telling us that this decade is the most important decade for the trajectory of the planet. And because after that, it becomes quite difficult to make these changes because of sort of tipping points that the planetary boundaries that Johan Rockström and other scientists talk about. So for us, I think the opportunity is there, the groundwork has been laid out, the fundamental inclusion of humans into conservation is now in everyone's mind. You have businesses lined up, you have governments getting ready to get lined up. Now it requires people. It requires us to hold businesses and government accountable and play our part in making that transition happen.
I fully agree with you. I would like to ask you on how can nature-based solutions tackle emissions? And if you can provide us with cases from different parts of the world in which significant impact was achieved when it comes to NBS.
Sure. So nature-based solutions when it comes to climate change can be really broken into two categories. And I'm mostly interested in talking about one of them, but we can talk about both. So nature-based solutions is exactly what it means. It's solutions that come from nature for climate, right? So some people call it natural climate solutions, NCS. Some people call it NBS, essentially the same thing. The amazing thing about carbon on the planet is most of the carbon is not actually in the atmosphere, and it's not actually in fossil fuels. Most of the carbon on the planet is living carbon. It's the green stuff that you see around you. It's the trees, it's the mangroves, it's the seagrass, it's the plankton in the ocean. That's where most of the carbon is. And if we destroy it, like we burn the Amazon, we cut down mangroves, we release that carbon into the atmosphere. If we plant more, if we restore it, if we take care of it, it has the opportunity to suck that carbon back down into Earth. So trees over hundreds of millions of years are the only scalable, cost-effective solution we have to sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. It's quite an amazing thing, right? So natural climate solutions relies on this to basically manage carbon or CO2 in the atmosphere. The other side of it is nature can also be a barrier to bad things. It can prevent droughts, it can prevent storms, it can stop coastal erosion, it can stop hillsides falling down during rains. So that's the adaptation side of it, where nature can be used to help communities adapt to a warmer climate. If you plant trees in your cities in the Middle East, it obviously is going to be a bit cooler, right? So that's a nature-based adaptation to getting the planet getting warmer. The reason why we're so interested in nature-based solutions is twofold. One, actually I'd say three now. The first is that there's an enormous amount of carbon locked in nature. So here's an amazing statistic, Ibrahim, and this is something I've learned since I last met you. 3.3% of the planet contains almost 50% of what we call irrecoverable carbon. This is amazing. It's amazing. Just like, oil is not found in every country in the world. It's only found in very few spots in the world. The same thing is true with living carbon. most of the irrecoverable carbon, and when I say irrecoverable carbon, it means carbon that if you lose, you can't get back in our lifetime. Most of that is only found in a very small sliver of the planet, 3.3% of the surface area of the planet, like mangroves, for example. So by protecting these very important crops on the planet or restoring them, we actually get a huge amount of our carbon trapped. The second thing I'll say is that we cannot get to the Paris Climate Agreement, to the 1.5, or frankly, even the 2 degrees Celsius that we need to hold our planet to, if we do not also protect and restore nature. The math is impossible. If you lose the Amazon, if you lose the Congo Basin, if you lose Indonesian forests, you cannot get to the Paris Agreement. So it's not the only thing we need to do. We obviously need to cut down emissions too, and recycle and do all these other things. But you can't get to the number if you don't take care of nature. The third thing I'll say is it's the most cost-effective way to do something. So most of the money today going into climate change is actually going into technology. And there's a reason for that. And you're doing it right there around, your neck of the woods, right? You talk about solar, you talk about wind, and there's a lot of money going there. And as it gets cheaper, it can scale. Yeah. There's very little money going into nature-based solutions, which is a shame. It gives you a big return on investment. Yeah. And importantly, it also provides rural jobs. Rural jobs. So if you think about COVID and what it really did, it really created, if it created havoc for you in the cities, in the rural communities, in Kenya or in Zambia or in India or in Pakistan, in rural communities, it had a massive impact. Because that one family, who sent their one person to go work in a factory in the city, if they can't do that, it's not just 5 years of their life that they're losing, but that one child that they had to educate, to put in college, is not going to college anymore. Yeah. It's not going to school anymore. So it is going to have a generational impact. So, and most governments are focusing their recovery efforts on cities. And I'm really keen to make sure the recovery efforts are also happening in the countryside, in the remote rural areas of the country. And this is where nature-based solutions are so important. Because if you put people to work restoring forests, restoring mangroves, taking care of forests, what you're really doing is creating rural, long-term, sustainable jobs.
Which I think, I just saw a question on social sustainability, and I'm glad you tackled on that. And absolutely, I think we're all in agreement on that. And I think it's a good reminder to us on the lack of access to capital when it comes to nature, which is spot on, which is the base of, and I really like the point when you mentioned that we can never achieve Paris Agreement without taking of the forest, which is, by the way, it's a fundamental point of talking about climate action, which is not being talked a lot about recently. You talked about COVID, and I would like to know, in your opinion, the role of nature-based solutions in preventing future pandemics, because WHO now is telling us, hold on, like we know the world can take care of COVID in 3 months, but hey, this is not the last pandemic. So how can NBS help us to prevent other future pandemics?
Sure. And can I just, before I do that, can I just address one thing you just said about access to capital?
Yes.
So this is a really important point, and it's particularly important, I think, for audiences in the Middle East here listening to this. So access to capital for nature-based solutions is a major, major challenge. You're completely right. People will put huge amounts of money, billions, on, some harebrained scheme that won't come to bear. Think about all the money we put into a company like WeWorks and how highly it was touted without looking at the fundamentals of what that company really was. And then people lose that money and it's like, oh no, it's fine. Okay. I'm being a businessman. But for nature, people hold it to a much higher standard, much, much higher standard for risk management, which is quite an unfortunate thing. But here's what I'd say. Right now, with the stock market, with the way things are, the world is awash in capital. Companies are sitting on very large balance sheets. Yeah. And with the hype, with the inflated sense of the market, it is not clear what you can do with that money.
Absolutely.
Okay. So someone told me yesterday on a conference call that I was on a video call, that there are trillions of dollars right now earning negative interest. Trillions of dollars earning negative interest. Just sitting there, literally inflation is taking a bite out of it. So we just launched earlier this week a new fund with Apple, right? It's a $200 million fund called the Restore Fund. And the partners of this are Apple, Goldman Sachs, who manages the money, and CI. And we want others to join this fund. This is why this fund was so interesting. It isn't a gift from Apple to Conservation International to go do good work. This is a fund that is supposed to earn some interest, at least meet inflation plus,
okay,
protect your money, but also give you a carbon return. So this $200 million fund, which we hope to grow, so let's pretend we manage to grow it to $1 billion or more, but this $200 million is not, it's an important amount of money, is going to be invested in forestry projects in carbon-rich places around the world. So that you as an investor, you know, Ibrahim, if you decide to join this fund, you put some money into it, hopefully we are going to give you a return. We're going to protect your capital and give you a modest return. But more importantly, we're also going to give you a carbon return that you can count on. So this is a way for companies to use their healthy balance sheets to do some good without making sure that capital doesn't walk out the door.
Absolutely.
See, when you're in a company, the big challenge you have is it's not because you don't want to do some good. You got to go talk to your treasury guy in your company, and he doesn't want the money leaving the company. He wants to see it on the balance book. Same thing is true for Apple. They have a very healthy balance sheet, as you know. They're sitting on a lot of money. So they can look at it and say, yeah, this money hasn't walked out the door. We haven't given it to CI. We're just jointly managing it with them. They're going to help make sure it goes to good projects that are going to do good forestry, but also give us a return. And we love the fact that it's giving us a carbon return. So there are very clever mechanisms we can now put into place that go beyond philanthropy. I still think philanthropy is important. Don't get me wrong. It's what pays my salary. But charity alone is not going to be enough, right? So we need to find ways to use that capital. Now, to your COVID question, let me just say it this way. As I said, every pandemic like this one, as far back as we can think of, starting with Ebola, HIV, SARS, Nipah, and now COVID, came from nature. It came from our interaction with nature. It came from our invasion of nature. There's a very good paper that came out last year, I think in the journal Nature or Science, in one of the sort of the top prestigious journals that our scientists contributed to, that said that if we can end tropical deforestation, we can change the risk of a new pandemic by almost 30%. It's not a guarantee. It doesn't mean you won't have it. But think about the trillions and trillions of dollars that this pandemic has cost the economies. Think about the millions of lives that have been lost because of this pandemic. And you realize that ending deforestation makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. So this is how I think that, when you now protect forests, particularly tropical forests, when you restore forests, what you're doing is you're not only adding to your climate, doing something good for the climate, actually doing something absolutely necessary for the climate, you're also making the world safer in terms of this economy crippling pandemic.
I feel like it's resetting, using nature to reset the system, which way maybe what we may need post COVID-19. Sanjayan, you talked about financial institutions, and this is a great news. Like yesterday, I was reading a news that the banks started to do a coalition for net zero. And I think HSBC is one of them. And I really hope we see similar movement similar to what you mentioned on living carbon-rich areas, where banks, which I think is under the umbrella of UNEP Financial Initiative, FI, sustainable finance. And it will be good to see more into the direction of investing more in nature. But yet, if I may ask, one of the important stakeholders, governments. What's the role of governments? How they can engage citizens? Because at the end of the day, I saw a question about the social sustainability. So this is not, for me, nature-based solutions, NBS or climate. They're not only about environment. You talked about creating jobs. You talked about sending children to school. So how government can promote more for it? Because there are many stakeholders as well when it comes to policies, and how they can engage their citizens.
Government has an amazingly important role to play. The role that government should play is to level the playing field, to put the guardrails. Right now, for NBS, for nature-based solutions, government is mostly absent. They haven't given the guidance or the guardrails. You know what guardrails are like when you're walking down a very steep place, you're holding on to the side, you know? They haven't given us that for the most part. So when I talk about, you know, if you are a company investing in forest conservation, you get some carbon credits. Government hasn't really said, here's the way the credit should work. These are the companies that are allowed to get the credits. These are the ways they fit into the national standards. The challenge with that is that it allows companies and nonprofits like mine to essentially create the rules. That's a bad thing. That should not be our responsibility to do that. It really, government, you know, you don't want government to be too intrusive, but you do need government to set a playing field, to say these are the general rules that we need to follow. They're not doing that right now with national nature-based solutions, and they're not really doing that with sending signals that investments going into these areas will be backed in the long term by government certainty. So you take something like the price on carbon. You know, how much do you pay for a ton of carbon? It's all over the place. It's all over the place. In some places, it's a few pennies. In other places, it's tens, you know, $10, $20, $40 a ton.
Yeah, and there's a question also on credibility as well.
Of course, of course. So we do need governments to get involved in this. We need them to do it for their own countries, but we also need them to do it jointly and kind of set some parameters. Otherwise, it's going to be like the Wild West. There'll be winners and losers. And unfortunately, we always know who the losers are going to be. The losers ultimately will be the environment. It'll be the poor. It'll be the marginalized. It'll be the dispossessed.
Thank you. Okay, I can see I have more questions, Sanjayan. Like, you know, you're really inspiring. And
but by the way, on nature-based solutions, you know, I will say that the part of the world that you live in has always experimented with nature-based solutions. You know, if you look at the mangrove and seagrass restoration that is happening off your coast, the coral restoration, the tree planting, or, you know, you go to one of your nature reserves and you can see rewilding. You know, you see things like the Arabian oryx and the gazelles being, you know, restored. This is because you live in a place that is fortunately wealthy, that has a lot of technical capacity, that has the ability to bring in lots of great minds from all over the world and put them in a society where they can all contribute, right? This is the thing that now needs to be exported to other parts of the world.
Well, I was going to ask you a question about that, but the Q&A questions started to be filled. So if I don't mention the name, it means that it's anonymous. If there is a name. So we have a question is, do you think nature-based solutions should be included in companies' annual targets?
Yes, 100%. That's a very simple question. Yes, credibly so. It gives you a quick pathway to achieve some goals that otherwise will take a long time. Like, you know, your company could reduce its use of a lot of things, but you still may need to get on a plane and fly. You still have to ship goods. There is some things that are still going to be carbon intensive. You should use nature-based solutions in order to offset those carbon intensive parts of your work that you don't have a pathway of changing. It should be in your annual targets. It should be linked to the pay of your chief sustainability officer. It should be linked to the compensation of the CEO. And some of the best companies are actually doing that now.
Thank you. And then we'll make sure we follow this advice and manage the Futtaim. So Edna is asking, speaking of deforestation, where does commercial forestry stand in the deforestation conversation?
Yeah, very, very good point. So, you know, this Apple fund that I talked to you about, the Restore Fund that we launched with Apple and Goldman Sachs 2 or 3 days ago, does invest in what is essentially commercial forestry. So I think commercial forestry, if done right, if certified at the high standards, if done thoughtfully, not just forestry, but also restoration of forestry, is a hugely important part of meeting our carbon targets. It can provide jobs, it can provide habitat, it can protect water, but importantly, it can also capture carbon.
Thank you. Another question. Can the impact of nature-based solutions be measured? If so, how?
You know, the good thing about nature-based solutions is, so it's a very, very good question. You know, when I talk about love and value, the problem with nature-based solutions is until recently, we had a very hard time putting a number to that value. Because how do you value biodiversity? You know, how do you value the air you breathe? How do you value the water you drink? It can be done, but it's not easy. And it is a bit complex to try to explain the value of a monkey in the forest, or a lion, or a elephant. However, with carbon, you can do it quite precisely. So the thing about carbon, which we weren't talking about, 10 years ago, is that when you think about nature-based solutions for the planet, it is a very quantifiable thing. We can talk about tons of carbon, and we can talk about a price on carbon. So I think that it gives us a pathway to really putting a dollar figure on, restoration and protection of nature. Now, it's always going to underestimate it, because you're not adding the value for biodiversity. You're not adding, let's say you do some seagrass restoration off the coast of the UAE. You can measure the carbon, and you can value it, and you can put it on your account sheet. What you aren't measuring really is the dugongs that are coming in grazing on it half the year. You're not measuring the fish that are using it. You're not measuring the reduction in storms that are hitting your coastline, or erosion, right? Those are harder to measure. So the good news is when you measure carbon, you're always underestimating the value, because all this other stuff gets added on top, which makes it even more valuable.
Thank you. Another question. Can planting trees, mangroves, help companies achieve their net zero commitments?
I'm sure this question came from you now, Ibrahim.
No, actually, it's anonymous. I have another question on that positive, but we already had the discussion. But seriously, it's anonymous.
It is the best way a company can target maximum carbon. So mangroves, there's no reason why we should still be destroying mangroves. Just no reason at all. They're only found on a tiny part of the planet. And, if they contain, in some places, 6 times more carbon than an equivalent tropical forest. So if you think about carbon density, mangroves are amongst the most carbon dense habitats on the planet. They protect coasts from storms and sea level rise. They provide habitat for fish, for fisheries. They provide habitat for wildlife. They are a very hard-working ecosystem. So if you're a company and you want to very much target your impact and you want to get that maximum return, mangroves are a way to do it. It's called blue carbon. In fact, we talk about Apple, and obviously they're a leading company, but the first project Apple really did with this was a mangrove restoration and protection project. 27,000 acres of mangroves in Colombia that Apple and Tiffany's, the jeweler Tiffany's, helped support in order to protect. Why did they pick mangroves? I mean, Apple could go pick anything they want. Why go all the way to Colombia to protect mangrove? Because we could show them that it was really carbon dense, and it provided a lot of benefits to the fishing communities that have that. And in your region, obviously being a mostly coastal region, you see the opportunity to restore the coastline, to help prevent sea level rise, but also to export that methodology to other parts of the world.
Thank you. By the way, we have many questions, and I'm glad you like the questions so far. We have an AI question here. Do you have an example of nature-based solutions that are also artificially intelligent?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think, there must be some. I can't think of, we are using AI for certain things at Conservation International. So we have a program called Wildlife Insights that use all these remote cameras around the world that take pictures of wildlife. It uses AI to quickly identify what animal it is. So if you see the tail of something, it'll say, oh, it's a tiger. And it's AI enhanced, and it uses AI to do that. I think that the way AI is probably going to play a big role with carbon is in being able to identify places that are high carbon habitats, and also to monitor damages to the environment. So it is, if you can use AI to train machines to be able to do this at a scale and speed that is very quick, you can sort of figure out how to do it. You drink a lot of coffee. I drink a lot of coffee. So coffee can be grown under trees. I didn't know this, but most coffee is grown on small farms. There's no big coffee farmer. Most of Starbucks coffee, for example, comes from 365,000 smallholder farms. And a fair amount of it's grown under shade. So understanding whether people how they're taking care of that coffee under that shade is quite a challenge. You can use AI, for example, to look at how coffee farms are actually taking care of that land and being able to survey it, because you can't do it individually because there's too many farmers to one at a time go and look at it. So I think you're going to see more AI being used in carbon for sure. It's going to be used in monitoring, and it's going to be used in measuring carbon.
Thank you. We have a question from Greg. Good afternoon, Ibrahim and Dr. Sanjay. I have serious concerns about habitat transformation through planting trees in desert environments or mangroves in mudflats, coastal habitats. Could you comment on how we could avoid the risk to natural environments? And I think this is related to maybe to a question by Omar Tatanani. What are your thoughts on conservation locally versus internationally? Is it always better to focus efforts on local conservation?
It's always good to start local, but we know now that the planet is connected. So what happens in the forests of Africa or in the far reaches of Asia or in the Amazon really does affect us all. Like we know this. We know this with pandemics. We know that with vaccinations, it's no point vaccinating only one country because eventually we're all connected and I'm not going to be able to visit you and you're not going to be able to visit me. So the thing that we fully understand now is the interconnectedness of it. I think it's always good to start local because you learn a lot locally, but then it is really in our best interest to then be able to transport that idea externally. You know, when President Biden was doing before he became president, you know, he made a commitment for putting $20 billion into the protection of the Amazon rainforest. And you think, well, why does America care about the Amazon rainforest when we've got a lot of challenges here in the United States? It's very simple. If the Amazon burns, it makes climate change worse for all of us, Americans as well as Brazilians, as well as people around the world. So yes, start local, go international when you can. In some parts of the world, and I would say for the Middle East, it has always been an interconnected. The Middle East has been a marketplace for global ideas for as long as humans have been civilized. Long before oil, it was a marketplace. Long before that was pearls. Long before that, you can just go back and trace why everything went through. It was the crossroad of religions. It was the crossroad of commerce. Now too is the time to do exactly that, to remain the marketplace of grand ideas around the world. What was your first part of that?
Greg talks about having plants.
Oh yeah, very good point. Yes. So you obviously want to plant the right trees in the right places at the right time. It is very important that I'm not talking about a eucalyptus plantation where it doesn't last, or a pine forest where it shouldn't be. I'm talking about native or natural restoration as the primary means of restoration, but human assisted. We know with mangroves, it is not a question of planting mangroves. You know, you see these records all the time. This country planted 1 million mangroves, you know, in one day. You know, you see these records, they're mostly not that great because if you go back a few months later, they're gone. So we know because of the work we're doing, for example, in Costa Rica, if you're going to restore mangroves, you first have to understand the hydrology. And understanding the hydrology allows that restoration to take place in the right way. So yes, plant the right trees in the right places. That's what I'm talking about.
I think this answers your question, Muhammad Asfour, Jordan. From Jordan, how important is it to focus on native plants and reforestation efforts? I think Sanjan just answered it. We have a question from Ramzi. Excellent session, Ibrahim, and thanks for putting it together. The discussion from developed nations continue to be towards achieving carbon neutrality, as they might be allocating resources and developing the know-how in achieving it. But is that enough? Developing nations don't have such resources, and so the planet will never achieve this goal. Don't we need additional efforts from developed nation or an extra tax for them to be net positive?
Yes, of course, it is completely right. I mean, this is the big debate, right? This is the big debate. What right do we have to go to Liberia or to go to Sri Lanka or to go to Cambodia and say, you have to do it this way now that we've done it this way? So we're going to slow down, but you have to completely transform. It's deeply unfair. And this has always been the big challenge with Paris. I mean, the reason we got to the Paris Climate Agreement was because we broke through that and said, okay, we understand, what can you do voluntarily? And let's count that, right? They try to get away from this argument of, we cannot make progress until rich nations pay poor nations in order to make transformations happen. We got away from that. But at the fundamental nature of this question, yes, you have to have a transition or a transfer of technology, of skills, of opportunities, and of capital in order to hasten the challenges that the developing nation, the global south, is facing. Yeah. You know, look, what I would say to any country or any president of any country in the global south is that my message is, it's not don't develop. It's not don't aspire to have a better life for your citizens. But don't make the same mistakes we have made in that pathway to development. Sure. Why don't you skip a step? Why don't you leapfrog us? Why don't you do it in a way that is ahead of what we are doing? And that's what the imagination and the faith requires you to do. So it's a very good question. I am very careful how I use these words. I'm not telling anyone to do it, but I know if we don't all do it, we're not going to get there. And this is where the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility and other global institutions are so important, as well as bilateral aid, as well as technology transfer. And this notion we talked about, access to capital, that's a big one. You know, that's a big one for any of these transformations.
Thank you. We have a question. What's your #1 advice for startups and SMEs who don't have access to capital, but still want to conserve Earth?
So it depends whether you're in that business or not. So what I would say with a startup is, whatever you're doing, whatever you're working on, build sustainability into the business model from day one. Because eventually, if you're successful, it's going to catch up with you. Investors are going to look at that. And certainly if you want to scale, it's going to be a stumbling block. So why not do it right from the beginning? You're not going to be able to do it right later on. You know, it's better to do it from the beginning. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that if you're working in sustainability, you know, yes, there is still a difficulty with access to capital, but I think that is changing, and I think it's changing much faster than I thought. I think that the appetite for new models of sustainability is quite high right now. And so I feel fairly bullish that you can access capital and it'll be easier in the future, not more difficult. You know, the signals that some of the sums of money that governments are now talking about, that companies are now talking about, you know, we are really going to struggle to actually meet those targets, not because of demand, but because of supply. You know, this NBS stuff I'm talking to you about, the big challenge I have is not that companies are not willing to put money into conservation or restoration. The big challenge I have is developing enough projects to meet that demand.
Yeah. Well, that's a good problem to have, I guess.
It's a great problem to have.
So we have a question on what kind of framework and tools can we implement at the national level to further integrate the private sector in environmental governance?
You know, I think the big one is around carbon. I think we need some rules about what kinds of companies can access the carbon market, and what kind of benefits they get from it. So I think that companies need to demonstrate that they are on a pathway to neutrality before they are allowed access to natural climate solutions. I think that, you know, the quality of the projects has to be very high. I think there has to be things that prevent greenwashing from happening. I don't think it's a huge problem, but I think you need to prevent doing that. So, you know, I think, like, in general, I would say, you know, the thing that I'm most hopeful about is that companies today are willing to think about sustainability at a scale that I've never imagined. The downside is that their ability to still work with governments is still a little fractured. And we need that to be better aligned, because, you know, it's the role of governments to set the rules and to level the playing field and kind of get out of the way. It's the role of companies to move capital very quickly.
Okay, I would like to ask a question now, and I think we answered most of the questions, and apologies for the people who did not answer. I think we're just running out of time. But from a macroeconomic perspective, how big is the nature-based industry, or how big it can be as well? And what are the 3 top factors from your perspective that could build a strong case for emerging markets, so such as the UAE? Now, you talked about the Middle East, and I always think Middle East and beyond. We look at Southeast Asia, we look at South Asia, our neighbors. So it's an extension of the whole continent when it comes to Asia, Africa, for example, to invest in it, which is a great opportunity. Also, can you give us a couple of governmental policies or programs that are transforming this industry? And apologies for the long question.
So you asked first about what are 1 or 2 of the biggest, so how big is the market?
Yes.
Right? It's enormous. I should actually know the number, but I think people are re-estimating it all the time. So when I say it's enormous, it's in the trillions. It's not in the hundreds of millions, it's not in the billions, it's in the hundreds of billions. It's in the trillions. It is an enormous, enormous market. That's what is kind of astonishing about it, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that the big challenges to it is on the supply side, not on the demand side. This is a complete change for me from the last 5 years. Yeah, 3-4 years ago, we were running around trying to sell a good carbon project to whomever would buy it. Yeah, here's a project in Peru. Here's a project in Kenya. It's a good project. Can you know? Ibrahim, I promise you, it's completely different now. Now I don't have enough projects. We're in a race to create supply. All right. So that's pretty amazing. The third thing I would say is that supply is the opportunity as well. So most companies, this is the way they work. They're basically saying, can you go develop a project for us? They always want it immediately. But they're like, because the CEO has made a commitment or the board has told them to do something, right? So then they're like, I was talking to an airline about a year and a half ago, just before the lockdown, actually. It's a big global airline. And they said, we would like to invest $100 million in West Africa in natural-based solutions. And we're like laughing. We said, you can't. You just cannot do that. The policies aren't there. The communities aren't ready. You just will waste this money. You cannot do it. We actually said, no, we don't want 100. We want 10 million. Invest 10, and even that's going to be hard. And then scale up to 100, right? Wow. It's quite an interesting dilemma. The reason is, this is a company that wants to make a change very quickly. The CEO has taken this quite personally. And so they're making a commitment, or they want to make a commitment, and they're like looking around going, where do we get it? So here's what I think. So the way companies work is they will give you money to go develop a project, and then they'll take the project and invest in it. That's a terrible way to do this from a conservation perspective.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you ever go to buy a car, right? If you go to buy a car, the first thing the car salesman will ask you, this is true in the US, I don't know if this is true in the UAE, but the first thing the car salesman will ask you is, do you have a car to trade in? And if you say, yes, I have a car that I want to, sell in order to buy this new car, he now knows he has 2 numbers to work with.
Yeah.
Right? It's a trick. It's a trick. Because he can, he can change one or the other now to get the most from you. What we don't want to really do is to develop a carbon project just for one company, because then they're going to get you on the price on both ends.
Yeah.
What you want to do is create a supply, like a marketplace, a portfolio of projects, and then come and say, here are 20 projects. You tell us how much carbon you want, and we're going to figure out how to manage the risk amongst this portfolio to give you the best price, but to also give you the best projects. We don't have that yet. And that's the role that I think that, we could really play in terms of developing this market in the future.
Okay, perfect. So the last 4 minutes, and before I wrap up, there is a question from one of the attendees, and then we can wrap up. You're a great storyteller We all agree on that. It's been really amazing listening to you, Sanjayan, as always.
Oh, thank you.
Can you tell us what is your most important life lesson, other than the swimming lesson, by the way, that taught you nothing is more important than our environment?
All right, it's a true story. So I was traveling in West Africa. I'd gone back to one of the countries that I'd grown up in as a child. This was in about 2006, so I was an adult at this point, or 2007. I was in Sierra Leone in West Africa, and I was in the deep forest, very far from the city. And I came into a small village, and I see a group of children who were cooking a monkey, a dead monkey. They were cooking it in a little pot. Now, remember, this was after Sierra Leone had emerged from a very horrific civil war, like one of the worst in the world, right?
Yes.
And what was amazing is there was a little fire, and there's a pot, and there's like 6 or 7 kids around it, and they were cooking this thing, and they were making the fire with a piece of metal like this big, and they were doing this. You know, they were waving the piece of metal to fan the flames. On the piece of metal was a sign. So they'd cut it, they'd got this from the road, from the side of the road, and it said WFP in blue. WFP stands for World Food Program.
Yeah.
Right? And it was like, I have a photo of this. I took a photo. So I've even published this. It was like a light bulb going off in my head, Ibrahim. Here were kids in a very poor environment, coming out of a civil war, who were using the signboard of the World Food Program in order to cook the food that they were going to eat, which was a monkey.
Wow.
It's a monkey. It was the reminder. This is not a knock on the World Food Program, who does amazing work, of course, but it was a reminder to me that when governments fail, when charities fail, when civil war interrupts, ultimately, the ultimate social safety net for people is nature. And this is true whether you live in Manhattan or Dubai or in Sierra Leone. The ultimate safety net for humans is nature.
Wow. Thank you so much. It's been an honor, really, Dr. Sanjayan. And just in conclusion, you've heard that at present, nature-based solutions only receive a small share of climate finance and sustainable finance. To maximize nature's contribution to climate action, the success of such solutions heavily depends on proper investment. And this is what we've heard today, especially that many initiatives are already being delivered, are credible, and can be exponentially scaled up if they are fully valued and receive proper investment. Having said that, I encourage everyone with us today, listening to us, and listening to this recording later on, to continue delivering on their sustainability goals while keeping nature-based solutions in mind. Again, thank you all for joining us today. And Dr. Sanjayan, it's been an honor and a pleasure to listening to you. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone. We're looking forward to have you in person here in Dubai or anywhere and spend more time listening to you and working together to support your work in Conservation International. Thank you all, and looking to see you all in the next session. Ramadan Kareem.
Ramadan Kareem. Thank you.